having talked about a relatively straightforward type of motivation that has to do with drive reduction, with hunger, let's change gears a little bit and talk about a very different type of motivation, sexual motivation. So this is the basically one of the things that makes it possible for our species and many other species to survive, right? The positive feelings and sensations that come with sex are kind of uh, a way to get us to engage in it and enjoy it, so we don't die out, essentially. So, thousands, not close to millions of years ago, as we were evolving, there would have been people that were that found it less enjoyable and people that found it more enjoyable. And there's probably some sweet spot toward the higher end of enjoyability that was selected for because those people were more likely to procreate at the like optimal levels and pass their genes on. So this is just kind of a an accident of evolution that, or not an accident, but a byproduct of evolution, that sex is like a pleasurable thing for us. And there are a lot of things that go into that. Of course, the hormones that become part of our biology as we grow up, the hormones that are affecting our primary sex characteristics when we are in utero, and then being released in different amounts to lead to our secondary sex characteristics when we pass through puberty. Are kind of enabling us to engage in sexual behavior, and then the way those hormones are released when we are excited sexually kind of lead us towards some of those behaviors too. So um, sex is very different as far as a motivation than hunger. Obviously, hunger, we're responding to a very specific physiological need. If we don't eat, like if we don't drink water, we die. Sex is different. Sex is not a sort of proximal need like that, because if it's not like if you don't have sex you're going to die, but it's more of an ultimate sort of need that if no one had sex, then we would die, right? That sex is required for human beings to continue existing. So there are a lot of things that are feeding into this type of sexual motivation. Some of them biological, we've talked about already. You need to be sexually mature. You need to have the proper hormones kind of pushing your behavior in the right directions. Sexual orientation, of course, is going to matter for who you're going to be attracted to. Psychological motivations are, the mood needs to be right, I guess. The social or the conditions around you, things that are stimulating you, fantasies, whether things are fitting with your preferences, those are all going to feed into whether you're sexually motivated or not. And then there are social cultural things that are going to matter, like different cultures have different mores and norms around sex, mores for who your partner might be, for how often is acceptable to have sex, for if it's acceptable for knowledge that you're having sex to be like publicly known, things like that, who you want to know, who you don't. There are lots of different things that might determine when and how often you're interested in having sex and with whom. So a lot of these things, just like eating, just like drinking and other types of motivation, there are biological, psychological, and social cultural forces that are shaping the way we go about satisfying these motivations. Don't want to discount the importance of things going on in your mind also. The psychological aspects of this are very, very important. Some evidence for this that, imagining things can be a very powerful force in sexual motivation. And some evidence of this, people that have no genital sensation because of spinal cord injuries or other injuries still feel sexual desire. So kind of like, I don't know, analogous in some ways to those experiments where, those studies where they remove the stomachs of rats to see, does removing this particular organ that has to do with this process make it so you're not hungry? Well, no, because it's a more complex process than that. And human beings that no longer have genital sensation can still feel sexual desire because they still have a lot of the other types of biological and psychological machinery that are going to enable that. So again, there's a lot going into sexual motivation, including stimuli from outside yourself and things that you are sort of generating in your imagination. But as for what we find sexually attractive, sometimes that's going to have to do with physical attractiveness. And I bring this up just to try to mention how this still all gets tied up in evolution, and what we find attractive often it has to do with reproduction, and specifically successful reproduction to keep our genes going on down the line. So if we look across cultures, there's kind of a universality of physical attractiveness. There is some broad agreement about what is attractive across cultures. There is variation, of course, across different cultures, but for the most part, people that are more symmetrical, first of all, are going to be more attractive, and there are other things that vary by gender. But this is something that is learned very early, and it seems that this is a combination of the way infants observe people being treated, but it also seems like it might have something to do with a more sort of biological perception of what other people are like. So infants as young as 2 months, before they've really had all that much socialization in this regard, are going to spend more time looking at attractive faces than unattractive faces, showing a preference for people that are more attractive. So it doesn't necessarily have to do with sexual attractiveness, but there's still a sort of bias towards conventionally attractive things. But if we get into reliable gender differences, obviously this is only getting to heterosexual sorts of attraction. There's not enough research, first of all, about homosexual attraction and bisexual attraction and other things across the spectrum. But if we just focus on heterosexual attraction for a moment, on average, women are going to tend to prefer men with a pronounced chin, pronounced brow ridge, pronounced large jaw, and a larger nose compared to men with smaller of those features, and upper body muscles. Men are going to tend to prefer women with small jaw and nose, full lips, large eyes, a particular waist to hip ratio, and a lower BMI. I'm not saying these are good things for men and women to prefer in one another, but on average, these are preferences that are observed. And both sexes tend to prefer partners that, like I mentioned earlier, have more symmetrical faces and symmetrical bodies. Now, why should there be such specific preferences for things in the opposite sex? Well, it has to do with reproductive fitness and passing your genes along. So I think, we think about human beings as social animals, but people discount the animal part of that a lot of times, right? So if we don't think about the social half, or if we don't think about the animal half, we're ignoring the fact that we are animals, like any other animal, right? Subject to the same sorts of evolutionary forces, adapting to the same sorts of pressures as other animals. So we shouldn't place ourselves like separate from the animal kingdom. We're part of it that is subject to the same sorts of issues. And chief among those issues is that our genes are passed on through reproduction, and that natural selection that's involved in that selects for people that have preferences that are going to maximize their genes being passed on. So over tens of thousands of years, what this means is we have a preference for people of the opposite sex, if you're heterosexual, that is going to maximize that sort of reproductive fitness. So that's why that we tend to see these relatively stable preferences in heterosexual men and women. Because men tend to prefer women, not just because it's nice to have a large jaw, that just indicates something more important. It indicates they have testosterone, immune system strength, and they're developmentally mature. These kind of random things in women indicate presence of estrogen, fertility, and youth. And in both sexes, more symmetricality in the face and body is going to indicate that they are healthy and that they have not had a disturbance in their development, like malnutrition or some sort of disease that could be a problem if they, pass it on to their children. So these things that we find attractive are not just because they are innately beautiful. it's because they're indicating these things that would indicate that this person is a suitable reproductive partner, and that if you reproduce with that person, then your children will have a good chance of survival, and that will pass on your genes. So it's not like people are walking around deciding this. They're thinking, yes, I want to find a suitable genetic specimen for me to be able to pass on my genetic code. No, but the pressures of natural selection have led us to have these preferences to sort of automatically lead to these things. And I'm not saying everyone all wants these things all the time. You can separate um, uh, proximate explanations from, or sorry, ultimate explanations from proximate explanations. Ultimate explanations are things like this, where we have these preferences for reasons of natural selection that are going to happen on average for people. However, proximate explanations, like what's going on in your immediate social environment, things that you actually like about a person, things, idiosyncrasies about what you prefer. Those things are going to kind of work with and in conflict with one another to determine what you actually like. These are very broad, average sorts of tendencies. Another thing that fits in here is an interesting idea called parental investment theory that is going to determine some differences in preferences for heterosexual men and women. Because of biological differences in men and women and their role in sexual reproduction, there are different pressures on men and women. So women, females, have to invest more than males when it comes to reproduction because they have to carry the child. And generally, historically, maybe not like normatively desirably, but historically, women are going to be more involved in the upbringing of a child. And they, have fewer years in which to reproduce. There's kind of an upper limit on how many children a woman can have that does not exist for men. Men could theoretically have an almost infinite number of children because they don't have to carry it. They could impregnate different people and have, many, many, many more children than women could have in theory. So, because of this, to maximize their reproductive fitness and the likelihood that their genes are going to be passed on, it's in men's best interests in this very broad, specific sense to be less selective and have many partners. And it's in women's best interest to be more selective. Because if you choose the wrong mate, you're wasting that resource of your body carrying that child and the time that it takes to develop it and raise it. So there are these sorts of differences in sexual motivation in this way, that it might be, on average, women are going to be more selective for these sorts of evolutionary reasons, and men might be less selective for kind of related but opposite reasons. Now, whenever I talk about this stuff, I like to make it very clear that I'm not making any normative statements about how anyone should act. I'm saying this is a theoretical perspective that helps explain why we might see differences in the way males and females approach relationships. Does the ultimate explanation that it's like evolutionarily advantageous for you to be a like philanderer as a man and have as many partners as possible, does that make it like normatively and culturally good to like cheat on people all the time and have all kinds of kids that you don't take care of? Obviously not. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that this does explain some types of average differences that we might see, even though there are all sorts of things that are quote unquote natural that are bad, like violence or taking advantage of other groups, for example. So there's something in evolutionary perspectives that people bring up called the is-ought fallacy. Just because something is true doesn't mean it's right or it ought to be true, right? So just to be very clear about what I'm trying to say with this is not that men should have as many sexual partners as possible, and women are only allowed to have some. That's not what I'm saying at all. But it is what this sort of perspective suggests in some ways. Okay, to wrap up, talking about some other motivations and needs, just to round out this with some more sort of social things. It's important to note that we also, as a species, have a very powerful need to belong. We want to feel like we're accepted. We want to feel like we're part of a group. And when we are separated from other people, that kind of increases that need, or it increases how it affects us in some way. Something I think we've all probably experienced recently, right? That you might feel disconnected, and that need to belong might be affecting you in different ways. So, we want to belong by thinking about how we're going to interact with other people, and it's going to affect how we think and feel in a lot of senses. And if we are accepted by other people, it's going to make us feel better, generally, and being separated from people is going to make us feel worse because of that lack of social acceptance. We want to belong so badly that we tend to stick with relationships even when they are not very good for us, because it might be down the road that those relationships are beneficial. And when we're excluded from groups, especially ones that are important to us, this can make us feel demoralized, depressed, and make us lash out in some ways. And as I've talked about, in the relationships unit, we talked about some things about social ties and health. People that have more close friends, who are happier and healthier, are going to be, people that have close friends tend to be happier and healthier. And it's very complicated about whether that's like a cause and effect relationship, or having close friends is related to other behaviors that promote happiness and health. But in any case, there is a very strong relationship there. Another reason we have this need to belong is because of some of the sorts of ideas I've been talking about here, like evolutionary psychology wise, that having social bonds and being able to cooperate with other people is basically how human beings have been able to be successful as the very kind of squishy, fragile species that we are. We're not very tough. We don't have big claws. We can't see very well in a lot of in low light. We don't have that good a sense of smell. We are not as equipped as some animals to survive in the world, but by banding together and cooperating, we became much more successful as a species. So protecting each other from predators, especially protecting our young from predators when our young, as we learned early in this class, takes so long to develop, even after birth, compared to some other species. And being able to reproduce and help each other parent and raise children, all these things are probably what lead to this need to belong. People that felt that need to belong were better off, and that is a trait that's been selected for over the millennia and generations. So the need to belong probably has a lot to do with adaptive fitness as well. Finally, I'll just mention the achievement motivation that I mentioned a little bit at the beginning. We also want to be successful in general. In part, that fits into our need to belong. People want to be friends and associate with people that are successful, but we also might want to be successful for intrinsic motivations, to master something, and to feel good about ourselves. It's very complicated to pull apart the different types of motivations that are leading us to want to be successful and achieve. We want to compare ourselves to other people and feel good about those types of social comparisons that we're making. But sometimes, of course, it has to do with rewards like getting paid for something, getting a good grade. Sometimes it's about maintaining self-esteem and feeling like you are successful or a smart person. But there are a lot of things that go into anything that we're engaged in, especially long-term things that we have to put a lot of planning and effort into. And of course, there's a lot more specifics about how we manage these things in the textbook that I would encourage you to take a close look at.